capitalism would self-destruct. And that's why it hasn't been instituted. The masters understand that they cannot survive a capitalist economy, laissez-faire economy. And you take a look at the history, it's pretty interesting. So the United States, when it was independent, so it could reject the rules of sound economics, and it developed. There were other countries that were poised for an industrial revolution and were given the same advice, like Egypt and India. In fact, India already was the commercial industrial center of the world, more so than England. Egypt was poised for an industrial revolution. And it's not impossible that it might have developed. It was a rich agrarian society. It had cotton, produced cotton. As I say, that's the main product, like oil today. And it didn't need slaves. It had peasants. It had a developmental government aimed at industrial development. It could have taken off, just as India could have taken off. But they were not free to reject sound economics because they were ruled by British force. So they were forced to accept sound economics. And Egypt became Egypt, and the United States became the United States. India went through a century of de-development until it finally got independence. That's what happens when you apply laissez-faire principles. In fact, that's essentially how the third world and the first world divided. You take a look at the countries that developed. They're the countries who violated the principles. England, the United States, Germany, France, the Netherlands. One country of the South, one country developed, Japan, the one country that wasn't colonized and was able to pursue the same course that the rich countries developed. I mentioned that in mid-19th century, 1846, Britain was so far ahead of the rest of the world in industrial development that they did decide that laissez-faire would be possible. So they moved to what's called the free trade era. It didn't, first of all, they imposed sharp constraints on it. They cut off the India. India was not allowed to, others could not invest in India, their main possession. And India was not allowed to develop. And there were other restrictions. But pretty soon, British capitalists called the game off because they couldn't compete. By the 1920s, they couldn't compete with Japanese production. So they literally closed off the empire to Japanese exports. That's part of the background for the Pacific War in the 1940s. The United States did the same with its smaller empire, the Philippines. The Dutch did the same with Indonesia. All the imperial systems decided no more free trade, we can't compete. So they closed off the empire, meaning Japan had no markets, no resources, and they went to war. That's a large part of the background. The United States in 1945 did move towards laissez-faire. In fact, there was an important conference. The United States was basically running the world at that point, for obvious reasons. There was a hemispheric conference called by Washington, February 1945 in Mexico, where the Western Hemisphere was compelled to adopt an economic charter for the Americas, which banned any interference with market principles. The goal was, you read the State Department reports, to oppose the new nationalism in Latin America, which is based on the idea that the people of a country should benefit from the country's resources. That's evil. Can't allow that. It's Western and U.S. investors who have to benefit from their resources. So that was the economic charter of the Americas, imposed on the countries of the hemisphere, with one exception here. The United States did not follow those policies. Quite the contrary, as I mentioned, there was a massive development of a state-based economy with an industrial policy, the kind that created the modern high-tech economy. You can see it right across the river. Take a look at MIT, right? One of the main centers of this. If you looked at MIT in the 1950s, when I got there, it was surrounded by electronics-based high-tech firms like Raytheon and iTech, you know, huge IT firms. You take a look at MIT today, take a look at the buildings. It's Novartis, Pfizer, and so on. The reason is completely obvious. During the 50s and 60s, the cutting edge of the economy was electronics-based. So the way to get the public to pay for it was to scream Russians and to get them to pay higher taxes for the Pentagon. And then the Pentagon would fund the research and development, like my own salary, for example. I shouldn't complain too much. And and of course, a so-called private industry was around there like vultures to pick up the products and the research and just market it. Well, since the 70s, the cutting edge of the economy has been moving towards being biology-based. So funding, government funding has shifted. Pentagon funding is declining. Funding from the NIH and other so-called health-related government institutions is increasing. And the private corporations understand that. So now Novartis, genetic engineering firms and so on are hanging around trying to pick up the research that you're paying for so that they can market it and make profits. It's just transparent. It's in front of our eyes. And it takes a very effective educational system to prevent people from seeing it. It's virtually transparent. That's the way really existing capitalist democracy works.